5:19 a.m. The Strait of Hormuz is narrow enough that you can see both coastlines on a clear day. Iran to the north, Oman to the south, and 20 miles of some of the most strategically contested water on the planet running between them. The USS Abraham Lincoln is transiting at 17 knots, her flight deck carrying 38 aircraft, her reactors pushing nearly 100,000 tons of steel through a shipping corridor so tight that her escorts have to stagger their formations to avoid the commercial tanker traffic moving in the opposite direction. From the flight deck, the ocean looks exactly the way it always looks at this hour: flat, silver, empty. 200 feet below the keel, the water is anything but. The sonar operator who first picks up the contact at 5:19 and 34 seconds doesn't call it out immediately. That is not carelessness. That is discipline. In the Strait of Hormuz, the acoustic environment is one of the most cluttered on Earth. Tanker propellers, commercial shipping noise, thermal layer distortion from the temperature differential between the Gulf's warm surface water and the cold, deep channel that runs through the strait's center. False contacts happen. Experienced sonar operators know the difference between noise and a signature. What appears on his passive sonar display at 5:12 and 34 seconds is not noise. It is a slow, mechanical pulse buried in the background clutter, repeating at an interval that has nothing to do with any commercial vessel. Diesel-electric propulsion, running on battery power, moving at barely 2 knots. He marks it, checks it against the acoustic library, checks it again. Then he says the words quietly and without drama. Possible subsurface contact, bearing 144, range 22 nautical miles. The room doesn't erupt, nobody shouts. The tactical display updates and the watch officer leans toward the screen and studies the return for 11 seconds before he responds. Keep tracking. 4 seconds later, a second acoustic trace appears from a different bearing entirely. 158 degrees, range 24 miles, a different acoustic fingerprint but the same propulsion signature. Same class, same speed, same depth profile. 2 submarines, moving toward the same point from 2 different directions. The watch officer straightens up and reaches for the intercom without looking away from the display. Then the third contact appears, bearing 129, range 26 nautical miles, faint, steady, closing. Nobody in that combat information center needed the watch officer to explain the geometry. 3 submarines approaching a single target from 3 separate bearings in a loose triangular formation is not an accident, and it is not a coincidence. It is a doctrine. Iranian submarine crews train for exactly this, a distributed attack from multiple angles that forces a surface ship to defend 3 threat axes simultaneously, making it geometrically impossible to evade all 3 torpedo solutions at once. The formation had been building for hours before the Lincoln's sensors found it. The submarines had been in position since well before first light, moving at 2 knots in the thermal shadow layer where the temperature differential between the Gulf's surface and deep water bends, sonar returns, and creates acoustic blind spots that passive systems struggle to resolve. They had been patient. They had been invisible. And they were now 22 nautical miles from the most valuable naval asset in the United States Fifth Fleet. At 5:17, the P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft that had been orbiting at 22,000 feet on its standard anti-submarine warfare track received the contact data from the Lincoln and began deploying sonobuoys. The P-8 carries the most advanced airborne anti-submarine warfare suite currently flying, a combination of passive and active sonobuoys that can be dropped in programmable patterns to create acoustic surveillance grids across hundreds of square miles of ocean. Within 6 minutes of the first contact report, 24 sonobuoys were in the water south and west of the Lincoln's position, their underwater hydrophones feeding acoustic data through satellite relay back to the carrier's combat information center. The grid confirmed all 3 contacts within 4 minutes of activation. It also refined their positions to within 200 meters and their depth profiles to within 15 feet. The submarines were at 280, 310, and 295 feet respectively, all 3 sitting just below the thermocline layer, all 3 still closing at the same steady 2-knot crawl. Chief Petty Officer Daniel Reyes had been running the acoustic analysis console in the Lincoln's Combat Information Center for 9 years and 3 deployments. He had tracked Iranian submarines in this strait twice before on previous deployments. Once during a routine transit where the contact never developed into a threat, and once during a heightened tension period in the Gulf where the submarine had turned away at 15 nautical miles after a series of aggressive active sonar pings from the escort destroyers. What he was seeing now was different from both of those contacts in one specific way that he noted in his log at 5:31 and later repeated to the investigating board in precise language. They did not turn away when we went active. In his experience, every Iranian submarine contact he had ever tracked had broken off its approach when the escort destroyers began active sonar pinging. It was the standard deterrence response, and it had worked every time. At 5:31, USS Nixie activated her hull-mounted AN/SQS-53C sonar and put 3 active pings into the water on the bearing of the closest submarine contact. The pings traveled outward through the strait at 1,500 meters per second, bounced off every hard surface in range, and returned to the Nitz's transducer array with the position of the submarine accurate to within 50 meters. Inside the Iranian submarine, the sound of 3 active pings at close range is not subtle. It is a declaration. You have been found. The standard response to that declaration is to turn away. The closest submarine contact held its course. Then the second contact held its course. Then the third. Reyes noted the time in his log. 5:33 a.m. All 3 contacts continuing approach. No evasive action. He underlined it once and said nothing to the room. He didn't need to. At 5:41, the tactical picture changed in a way that ended any remaining ambiguity about what the 3 submarines intended to do. The passive sonar array picked up a cavitation spike from the bearing of the closest contact, a sharp acoustic burst that the system identified in 0.3 seconds, and the sonar operator called out before the computer finished processing it. Torpedo in the water. The words reached every station in the Combat Information Center simultaneously. The tactical display updated. A new contact appeared at bearing 144, speed 48 knots, track converging on the Lincoln's position. Then the second launch signature. Then the third. 3 torpedoes, all fired within an 11-second window, all converging from 3 different bearings. The geometry the Iranian planners had spent months preparing was now in the water and running. The Lincoln's helmsman had his turn order before the third launch was called. The carrier began a hard turn to starboard, not because a 100,000-ton ship can outrun a torpedo, but because changing heading disrupts the torpedo's attack solution and buys time for the defensive systems to work. The turn rate was 2.3 degrees per second, limited by the physics of a hull that long moving through water that confined. The helmsman pushed the rudder to its maximum travel, and the Lincoln's bow began its slow arc while 3 weapons accelerated toward her from 3 different directions at 48 knots. The Nixie acoustic decoy system deployed from the stern at 5:41 and 22 seconds. 2 towed array devices streaming behind the ship on cables, each one broadcasting a synthesized acoustic signature engineered to mimic the Lincoln's own noise profile at higher intensity. The decoy sounds more like the carrier than the carrier does. To a torpedo's active sonar seeker, it is a louder, more attractive target than the hull it is designed to protect. The first torpedo seeker acquired the Nixie signal at 800 meters from the Lincoln's stern and began curving toward it. The track shifted on the tactical display, the red vector bending away from the carrier's hull and accelerating toward the acoustic ghost, trailing in her wake. At 340 meters from the decoy, the torpedo detonated. The explosion sent a column of water 40 meters into the air off the Lincoln's port quarter. The shockwave was felt through the hull. 2 sailors in the aft passageway lost their footing. No structural damage. The MH-60R Seahawk that had lifted off the Lincoln's deck at 5:38 had been running toward the closest submarine contact since before the torpedoes launched. Its sensor operator, Lieutenant Junior Grade Marcus Torres, had his dipping sonar in the water at 5:40 and 11 seconds and had the submarine's precise position refined to within 80 meters when the launch signatures appeared on his display. He didn't wait for authorization. The rules of engagement at that moment were unambiguous. He armed the Mark 54 lightweight torpedo on the port pylon and released it at 5:41 and 44 seconds, 3 seconds after the first torpedo launch from below. The Mark 54 entered the water 340 meters from the submarine's last known position, activated its active sonar seeker, and acquired the target in 1.8 seconds. The submarine attempted a crash dive, flooding ballast tanks to accelerate its descent below the Mark 54's effective engagement envelope. The attempt failed by 40 feet. The Mark 54 detonated at 5:42 and 19 seconds. The submarine's acoustic signature disappeared from every sensor in the strike group simultaneously. The second torpedo was still running. Its seeker had ignored the Nixie decoy, a newer guidance variant that the Lincoln's Acoustic Intelligence Library had flagged as a possible upgrade to the Iranian torpedo inventory 6 weeks earlier in a threat assessment that recommended updating the Nixie's broadcast frequency to counter it. The recommendation had been approved. The updated broadcast parameters had not yet been loaded to the Lincoln's Nixie system at the time of the engagement. The second torpedo's track held steady on the tactical display. Range 600 meters. Speed 48 knots. Time to impact 37 seconds. The second Seahawk, which had been tracking the third submarine contact northwest of the formation, broke off its approach and turned toward the incoming torpedo track at 5:42 and 01 seconds. At that range and closure speed, there was no time to deploy another torpedo against the weapon itself. The pilot descended to 40 feet above the water, and the sensor operator activated the Seahawk's dipping sonar in active mode. Not to hunt the torpedo, but to flood the acoustic environment in front of it with competing signals, creating enough sonar clutter in the weapon's seeker cone to degrade its target discrimination. The tactic is not in the standard anti-submarine warfare manual. It is a technique that had been discussed in the maritime patrol community for years as a theoretical option and had never been tested in a live engagement. The Seahawk held its position for 19 seconds while the torpedo closed. The weapon's track shifted 4 degrees, then 7. The seeker was processing competing returns and losing discrimination. At 180 meters from the Lincoln's hull, the torpedo's track deflected past the ship's bow by 23 meters and continued on a diverging bearing until it ran out of fuel and sank. It did not detonate. The third submarine broke contact at 5:42 and attempted to withdraw northwest at increased speed, a decision that ended its acoustic stealth the moment the propeller cavitation from the speed increase appeared on the P-8's sonobuoy grid. The P-8's tactical coordinator had the contact refined within 90 seconds. A second MH-60R Seahawk, which had been holding at low altitude east of the formation since the engagement began, received the targeting data at 5:44 and released a Mark 54 at 5:44 and 31 seconds. The submarine was at 220 feet and accelerating when the weapon entered the water. It reached 260 feet before the Mark 54's seeker acquired the hull at 5:44 and 58 seconds. The detonation was recorded at 5:45 and 04 seconds. The third submarine's acoustic signature disappeared from the sonobuoy grid 11 seconds later as the wreckage passed below the grid's detection threshold. At 5:47, the Lincoln's Combat Information Center completed its post-engagement sensor sweep. No additional subsurface contacts, no active sonar emissions, no torpedo propulsion signatures. The strait had gone quiet. The watch officer picked up the fleet command circuit and transmitted the engagement summary in 41 words. 3 Iranian submarine contacts engaged in Strait of Hormuz. 3 torpedoes fired at this vessel, all 3 defeated. 3 hostile submarines destroyed by Seahawk-deployed Mark 54 and Nixie countermeasures. Lincoln is undamaged and fully operational. The Lincoln resumed her base course at 5:49. The flight deck began its morning launch cycle at 6:02. The first FA-18E catapulted off the bow at 6:07 into a sky that was fully light now, the sun clear of the Iranian coast to the northeast, the Strait of Hormuz opening ahead into the broader waters of the Gulf of Oman. From the flight deck, the ocean looked the way it always looks: flat, calm, indifferent to what had happened beneath it 47 minutes ago. The tankers were still moving through the shipping lanes. The horizon was clear. 3 Iranian submarines that had spent weeks positioning themselves for a single moment were on the floor of the strait, and the Lincoln was already past the horizon. The engagement lasted 35 minutes from first contact to final detonation. 3 submarines, 3 torpedoes, 0 damage to the strike group. The Iranian crews had executed their doctrine with precision. The 3-axis attack formation, the thermal layer concealment, the coordinated launch window. Every element of the plan had worked exactly as designed until the moment it needed to work. And in that moment, a chief petty officer with 9 years of acoustic analysis experience, a junior lieutenant who released a torpedo 3 seconds after a launch signature appeared on his display, and a Seahawk pilot who held a hover 40 feet above the water for 19 seconds, while a torpedo closed on the carrier found 3 different ways to make sure it didn't.